Welcome to Eternal Elements Learning Podcast, brought to you by Atyasa Online. These podcasts are a part of the audio certificate programs on Atyasa Online. You're free to take these podcasts on your desired portal also, should you only wish to learn on the go. Thank you so much for engaging on these podcasts, and you can connect with the author on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Welcome back. This is Niket Karajagi, and I'm talking about international business management. This season is all about international business. I talked about WTO. I talked about what happens when there is regional integration that happens. There is an economic integration that happens. We discussed different kinds of integrations that can happen in my earlier podcast. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about the effects of integration. What happens when there is a regional integration that happens? Why is it that countries tend to move into regional integration, and what impact does it have on corporate enterprises? Now, regional integration definitely affects the political scenario, the economic scenario, the social scenario, the technological scenario, and the legal scenario. They have to undergo absolute change. However, I'm going to discuss two specific effects of integration. The first one is static, and the second one is dynamic. It's also called the static effect, and the second one is called the dynamic effect. Static effect is all about shifting of resources from inefficient to efficient companies as the trade barriers fall. So what happens when there is a static effect? All the places where there are inefficiencies, then these inefficiencies are then taken over by efficient companies, and the companies are then made efficient. Dynamic effect is an overall growth in the market, and it's an impact cause on the organizations because of expanding production. It's all about achieving greater economies of scale. So when we talk about the trade barriers being reduced or eliminated, that's one of the impact which creates static effect. The second part is that the trade barriers remain higher for non-member countries, as we discussed earlier. So two things happen. Within the integration, the trade barriers start falling, reducing, or getting eliminated. Whereas for the countries outside of the integration, the trade barriers may remain or they may be higher. We discussed that in our earlier podcast. Now, what happens when there is a static effect? Two things happen. One, trade gets created. So whenever there is a regional integration that happens, the trade starts getting shifted into those economic zones, economic areas. This investment shifts from less efficient to more efficient firms, which means what happens? The investments that are there with inefficient firms, they start looking for efficiencies. And then what happens is they start working on joint ventures, or they may move into direct expansion into the regions where economic integration has happened. So it becomes a great opportunity for companies which are inefficient. However, efficient companies can also start moving into the regional integration and start acquiring companies there, because obviously they are expanding their business interests. So two things can happen. Inefficient companies move into the markets to become efficient, and efficient companies can start taking over companies in those markets so that they become all the more efficient. So while the trade gets created because of the regional integration, trade diversion also starts happening. Now, what do you mean by trade diversion? FDI increases from firms outside of the free trade agreements to avoid barriers, which means what happens is that, let's say I am running a company outside of the integration, and I'm operating in a country of my own, and when I see that integration happen, I can decide to set up my operations in that zone where there is a regional integration that has happened, and just avoid the trade barriers that I would face because I'm operating in a third country. So static effect is trade creation as well as trade diversion. However, there is a dynamic effect also, and the dynamic effect is greater in size. Dynamic effect is there is trade creation. But how does the trade creation happen? It happens because of economies of scale. That means now suddenly the market starts expanding, and because the market starts expanding, the companies start moving in there. And while I talked about the FDI being put into the companies when inefficient companies or efficient companies want to move into the integration, here the organizations and people start moving in. People, in the sense entrepreneurs, start moving in because they see that trade has been created. And when trade gets created, economies of scale start happening. The average cost per unit falls. And that's what is the intention of all the companies. That means the number of units being produced and the number of units being sold go up tremendously when you start operating in the zones of regional integration, because regional integration creates a dynamic effect, which is the effect of market expansion. Now, interestingly, what happens is all the companies start moving in when the market starts growing, and therefore there is also an increased competition. But that's all right, because in international business, competition is a part of it. Because unless we compete, how do we create quality products? Unless we compete, how do we innovate? So that's another advantage for an organization for sure. So what are we talking about when regional integration happens? One, we're talking about static effect. Two, we're talking about dynamic effect. Under static effect, we're talking about trade creation and we're talking about trade diversion. Trade gets created because what happens is that investments start shifting from less efficient to more efficient firms, including foreign direct investment. Trade diversion starts happening because FDI increases from firms outside of the free trade area, and therefore they move in and they start investing, and that's where the trade diversion starts happening. So what is the difference between trade creation and trade diversion? In trade creation, companies move in because trade gets created within the regional integration. Trade diversion means because regional integration has happened, companies outside of that regional integration start moving into this space and bring in FDI into this space. Therefore, it's always a good idea for countries to come together and do regional integration. The market expansion is your dynamic effect. And in market expansion, like in static effect, the trade gets created. But what happens is that the home country firms increase FDIs to achieve economies of scale, which means what's happening is that when the market expands, obviously there isn't enough capital available for the market that expands. Therefore, what does the home country organization do? It starts bringing in companies from other countries in, their capital in, their technology in, so that they can achieve their economies of scale, and these are the effects of integration. It is a large and a huge subject to get into. I would definitely recommend that you pick up some books and read up the static and the dynamic effects that can happen. Thank you very much. This is Niket Karajagi signing off from this podcast on international business management, talking about the effects of integration. In the next podcast, I'm going to talk about once the economic integration has happened and you decide to move into certain countries, what are those factors that you must assess before you choose to enter a particular country and set up your operations. Thank you so much. I'm going to discuss the pestle model in the subsequent podcast. I'll see you in the next podcast. See you soon.